November 16th, 1532, the Andean highlands of what is now northern Peru. Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador with fewer than 170 men at his command, watched from the shadows as thousands of Inca warriors filled the plaza of Cajamarca. They came unarmed, their Emperor Atahualpa carried on a golden litter, resplendent in royal regalia, confident in his overwhelming military superiority. The Sapa Inca, divine ruler of the largest empire in the Americas, had come to meet these strange bearded foreigners. He had 80,000 battle-hardened troops camped on the hills surrounding the town, fresh from victory in a brutal civil war. Pizarro's tiny force was outnumbered nearly 500 to 1, yet by nightfall, thousands of Incas would lie dead in the plaza, their god-emperor would be in chains, and the greatest empire the Americas had ever known would begin its collapse. But this story is not about that massacre at Cajamarca. This is about what came after, about the weapon that nearly drove the Spanish back into the sea, about the warriors who wielded slings with such devastating effect that Spanish chroniclers would write in terror of stones that could break swords and kill horses. This is the story of how Inca slingers, using nothing more than braided wool and river stones, brought the seemingly invincible conquistadors to their knees. To understand the significance of Inca slingers during the Spanish conquest, we must first understand the sling itself. In an age of gunpowder and steel, it might seem laughable that a weapon as ancient as the one David used against Goliath could threaten armoured conquistadors. But the Inca sling, the huraca or waraka, was no primitive tool. It was a precision weapon that Inca boys trained with from childhood, a fundamental part of military doctrine in an empire that stretched from modern-day Colombia to Chile. The Inca sling was typically woven from llama or alpaca wool, sometimes cotton, measuring between 1 and 2 meters in length. Some Spanish accounts describe slings spanning 2.2 meters and weighing over 400 grams. The projectiles varied from smooth river stones to specially crafted clay or lead bullets. In the hands of a skilled slinger, these projectiles could reach velocities approaching 120 kilometers per hour, with effective ranges exceeding 200 meters. The Spanish conquistador who wrote that an Incan sling could break a sword in 2 pieces and kill a horse was not exaggerating. Every Inca boy learned to use the sling. It was not merely a military weapon, but an essential tool for herding llamas and alpacas, for hunting in the high Andes, for defending flocks from predators. By the time an Inca warrior entered military service, typically between ages 25 and 50, he had been slinging stones for 2 decades. This was not target practice. This was muscle memory built over years of daily use, the kind of proficiency that made hitting a moving target at 100 meters routine rather than remarkable. The Inca military understood the strategic value of slingers. Army formations placed them on the front lines, where they would unleash devastating barrages before withdrawing behind infantry armed with clubs, axes, and spears. An Inca army of 10,000 men might have 3,000 or more slingers, capable of projecting tens of thousands of stones in minutes. The psychological impact was immense. The sound of thousands of slings whirring through the air, the whistling of stones in flight, the crack of impacts, this created a wall of terror even before the projectiles found their marks. When Pizarro's force ambushed Atahualpa in Cajamarca's plaza, the surprise was total. The Incas who accompanied the emperor into the city were unarmed, carrying only ceremonial weapons. The Spanish cavalry charged, firearms roared, cannons thundered, steel swords cut through unarmoured flesh. Contemporary accounts describe the massacre with horrific clarity. Thousands of Incas died. Spanish casualties were either 0 or at most 5 men slightly wounded. The Inca warriors camping outside the city despite their overwhelming numbers, scattered in confusion when their living god was captured. The sheer shock of what the Spanish had done, laying hands on a being they considered divine, paralyzed Inca resistance. Atahualpa, hoping to secure his release, offered a ransom unprecedented in history. He would fill a room 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 8 feet high with gold, and twice over with silver. The Spanish agreed. For months, treasure poured into Cajamarca from across the empire. Gold artifacts, silver vessels, ornate jewelry, the accumulated wealth of generations melted down and divided among the conquistadors. The ransom was paid. And then, on July 26, 1533, despite receiving more gold and silver than they had ever dreamed possible, the Spanish executed Atahualpa. They strangled him with a garrote, claiming he had plotted against them. The execution of Atahualpa sent shockwaves through the Inca Empire. Many believed that with their divine emperor dead, the world itself might end. But it also ignited something else: fury. In the months and years following Cajamarca, as the Spanish pushed deeper into Inca territory, they would discover that surprise and shock were finite resources. The Incas adapted, they learned, and they found that while Spanish armour could turn away bronze weapons and even small arms fire at range, there was one weapon in their arsenal that Spanish plate and mail could not fully defend against: the sling. Spanish armour of the 16th century was formidable. Conquistadors wore steel cuirasses protecting the torso, helmets of various designs, sometimes full plate on the limbs, often chainmail. This armour was highly effective against the bronze-tipped weapons of Andean warfare. Inca clubs, axes and spears could batter and bruise Spanish soldiers, but rarely penetrate their defences. Even Inca arrows, when they were used, were largely ineffective against steel armour, but sling stones were different. A stone weighing 200 to 500 grams, travelling at over 100 kilometers per hour, carried tremendous kinetic energy. It didn't need to penetrate armour to be devastating. The concussive force could break bones through metal, crack ribs through breastplates, shatter limbs even when protected. Spanish accounts from the conquest describe helmets dented so severely that the wearer's jaws were broken, swords bent or damaged by sling impacts, horses killed outright by stones to the head. The Spanish quickly learned to fear the distinctive whir of approaching sling stones. Pizarro installed a puppet emperor, Manco Inca Yupanqui, a young prince who initially cooperated with the Spanish, hoping to use them to consolidate his own power after the chaos of the Civil War. For nearly 3 years this arrangement held. The Spanish nominally ruled through Manco, while they systematically looted the empire. But Francisco Pizarro's brothers, particularly Juan and Gonzalo, treated Manco with contempt. They imprisoned him, stole his wives, including his primary consort Cura Oclo, demanded endless tributes of gold, and subjected him to humiliations that no Inca emperor had ever endured. In April 1536, Manco Inca escaped Cusco under the pretense of retrieving a sacred golden statue. Instead, he raised the largest army the Spanish would face in Peru. Estimates vary, but chronicles suggest between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors answered his call. This was not merely an Inca army. This was a coalition of subject peoples, many of whom had chafed under Inca rule but who hated the Spanish more. Manco Inca had learned from living among the conquistadors. He understood their weapons, their tactics, their strengths, and crucially, their weaknesses. He knew that Spanish cavalry was devastating on flat ground but vulnerable in rough terrain. He knew that Spanish firearms were slow to reload and often ineffective in close combat. He knew that for all their advantages the Spanish were few, isolated and thousands of miles from reinforcement. On May 6, 1536, Manco Inca's forces descended on Cusco. The Spanish garrison, led by Hernando Pizarro with his brother Juan, numbered fewer than 200 conquistadors, supported by several thousand Indian auxiliaries of uncertain loyalty. The Incas had seized the fortress of Sacsayhuaman overlooking the city the day before. From that commanding position, Inca slingers began their bombardment. The initial assault was terrifying in its intensity. Inca warriors barraged Cusco with slings, projecting not merely stones but heated stones wrapped in cotton, incendiary arrows, anything that would burn. The city's thatched roofs ignited immediately. Flames consumed entire quarters. Spanish chroniclers describe fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, battling Inca warriors while desperately trying to prevent the city from burning to the ground. The conquistadors retreated to 2 large stone buildings near the main plaza, barricading themselves inside. For days the bombardment continued. Sling stones rained down from Sacsayhuaman's walls, from the surrounding hills, from every elevation that gave Inca slingers an advantage. The Spanish, for all their armour and weaponry, were pinned down, unable to venture far from their fortifications without facing withering fire from above. The effectiveness of the Inca slingers during the siege of Cusco cannot be overstated. Spanish accounts describe the sound as constant, a drumbeat of impacts on stone walls, on armour, on the earth itself. Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's cousin who was present at the siege, later wrote that the air was so thick with sling stones that it appeared as though it was raining rocks. The Spanish found that their armour, while protective, was not invincible. Sling stones large enough and travelling fast enough could dent helmets, bruise flesh through chain mail, and break bones through steel plates. One account describes a conquistador whose arm was broken by a sling stone despite wearing full arm protection. Another tells of a horse killed when a stone struck its skull. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the physical damage. The Spanish were accustomed to being the ones inflicting terror, not receiving it. Now they huddled in darkened buildings, listening to the endless barrage, wondering if the next stone to find its way through a window might be the one that ended their lives. Manco Inca's strategy was not to defeat the Spanish in pitched battle. He had learned from Cajamarca that Spanish cavalry and firearms gave them overwhelming advantages in open combat. Instead, he would besiege them, starve them, wear them down with constant bombardment from range. The slingers were perfect for this strategy. They could maintain fire from positions where Spanish cavalry could not reach them, and they had effectively unlimited ammunition in the form of stones. But the Spanish were not passive victims. They understood that Sacsayhuaman was the key. As long as the Incas held that fortress, they would dominate Cusco from above. On the night of May 15th, 1536, Juan Pizarro led a desperate assault on Sacsayhuaman. 50 Spanish cavalrymen, supported by native auxiliaries who remained loyal to the Spanish, charged up the steep approaches to the fortress. The Incas were waiting. From the terraces and walls of Sacsayhuaman, thousands of slingers unleashed a devastating barrage. Stones rained down on the Spanish force, horses screamed and fell, men were knocked from their saddles. The steep terrain neutralized the cavalry's shock value, and the Spanish found themselves fighting uphill against a prepared enemy with the high ground. Contemporary accounts describe the battle as chaos incarnate. Juan Pizarro, commanding from the front, was struck in the head by a sling stone. His helmet absorbed some of the impact, but the force was enough to fracture his jaw through the metal. He continued fighting, but the wound was mortal. He died days later, making him the most prominent Spanish casualty of the entire conquest. The Spanish eventually took Sacsayhuaman through a combination of courage, desperation, and brutal tactics. They used scaling ladders to assault the fortress walls, fighting hand-to-hand with Inca warriors who defended every terrace, every wall, every building to the last man. But the cost was terrible. The battle for Sacsayhuaman was one of the few times during the entire conquest that Spanish forces suffered significant casualties, and Inca slingers were responsible for many of them. The siege of Cusco continued for months. Manco Inca's forces could not dislodge the Spanish from the city, but the conquistadors could not break the encirclement. Both sides settled into a war of attrition. The Incas controlled the countryside, cutting off Spanish access to food and supplies. The Spanish held fortified positions in the city, their armour and weapons giving them advantages in close combat but making them vulnerable to the constant bombardment from range. The slingers adapted their tactics as the siege wore on. Spanish accounts describe how Inca warriors learned to target the horses specifically, recognizing that Spanish cavalry was the conquistadors' most effective weapon. They aimed for horses' heads and legs, areas not protected by armour. A dead or crippled horse not only removed a cavalry mount from Spanish service, but also provided meat for starving defenders. The Incas also began targeting Spanish soldiers' legs and feet, the areas least protected by armour. Contemporary chroniclers note that most natives adapted in guerrilla fashion by only shooting at the legs of the conquistadors where they happened to be unarmoured. This was not random. This was tactical learning, the kind of adaptation that indicated the Incas understood their enemies' vulnerabilities and were systematically exploiting them. By August 1536, the siege began to falter. Manco Inca's army, largely composed of farmers pressed into military service, could not abandon their fields forever without condemning their communities to starvation. The harvest season approached, and thousands of warriors began drifting away from Cusco, returning to their villages. The Spanish, starving and battered but unbroken, had survived. But Manco Inca was not finished. He withdrew to Ollantaytambo, a fortress town 70 kilometers northwest of Cusco, where he would prepare for the next phase of his resistance. And it was at Ollantaytambo in January 1537 that Inca slingers would achieve their greatest victory against Spanish arms. Hernando Pizarro, now in command at Cusco after his brother Juan's death, decided to end the stalemate by attacking Manco Inca directly at his headquarters. He assembled a force of 70 Spanish cavalry, 30 infantry, and approximately 30,000 native auxiliaries, primarily Cañari warriors who were traditional enemies of the Incas. This was not a tentative probe. This was a major offensive meant to crush Inca resistance once and for all. The Spanish were confident. They had superior weapons, armour and cavalry. Manco Inca had retreated to a fortress, which meant the Spanish could bring their full military might to bear in a set-piece battle where their advantages would be decisive. Or so they thought. Manco Inca had chosen Ollantaytambo for very specific reasons. The town sits in a narrow valley formed by the Urubamba River, surrounded by steep mountains. Access to Ollantaytambo is constricted, forcing any attacking force to approach along predictable routes. Above the town, Inca engineers had constructed 17 terraces climbing the hillside, topped by massive stone walls and temples. These terraces were not merely agricultural. They were military fortifications, each level providing a defensive position that had to be taken before attackers could advance to the next. But Manco Inca's greatest advantage was terrain, and his engineers had modified that terrain specifically to counter Spanish cavalry. The Incas diverted the Urubamba River, flooding the plains that Spanish forces would have to cross to reach Ollantaytambo's defences. When Hernando Pizarro's expedition arrived, they found the valley transformed into a waterlogged morass. The water reached the horses' girths, chest-deep on the animals, making cavalry charges impossible. The Spanish would have to fight on foot, advancing across flooded ground while under fire from elevated positions. And those elevated positions were thick with Inca slingers. The Battle of Ollantaytambo began with Spanish confidence and ended with Spanish retreat. As Pizarro's forces advanced across the flooded plain, thousands of slingers opened fire from the terraces above. Spanish accounts describe the barrage as relentless. Stones fell like hail, arrows, javelins and larger rocks rolled down from the terraces. The Spanish, bogged down in water and mud, could not maneuver. Their cavalry, normally their most devastating weapon, was reduced to struggling through knee-deep water while projectiles rained down from above. Spanish soldiers tried to advance to the terraces, but the Incas had prepared multiple defensive lines. Every terrace was a fortress. Every level had to be stormed individually. And from each successive terrace, slingers continued their bombardment. The Spanish found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They could not retreat without exposing themselves to pursuit, but they could not advance against prepared defences supported by overwhelming firepower from range. Several Spanish assaults were repulsed with heavy casualties. Contemporary accounts describe 13 horses killed, 8 Spanish soldiers dead, and over 1,500 native auxiliaries slain. For a force that had suffered minimal casualties at Cajamarca, this was devastating. And the Incas were not merely defending, they counterattacked. Manco Inca himself appeared in the battle, and Spanish chroniclers recorded their shock at seeing him. The Inca emperor was riding a horse, he wore Spanish armour, he wielded a Spanish sword. The Incas had learned not just Spanish tactics, but had captured and were using Spanish equipment. This was no longer a clash between Steel Age Europeans and Bronze Age Americans. This was a battle between forces that had learned from each other, where the side that adapted more effectively would prevail. And at Ollantaytambo, the Incas adapted brilliantly. The slingers were the key to Inca success. From their elevated positions on the terraces, they had clear lines of sight to the entire battlefield. They could concentrate fire on any point where Spanish forces attempted to advance. The flooded plain meant the Spanish could not close quickly, giving slingers extended time to target individual soldiers. Spanish armour, formidable as it was, could not protect against the volume of fire the Incas maintained. Eventually, Hernando Pizarro recognized the futility of the assault. By night, the Spanish retreated, fighting a running battle back to Cusco, with Manco Inca's forces harassing them every step of the way. One Spanish account describes the retreat as humiliating, the conquistadors fleeing like madmen while Inca warriors nipped at their heels. This was the only clear battlefield victory the Incas achieved against Spanish forces during the entire conquest. It was won through brilliant use of terrain, tactical innovation, and above all, the devastating effectiveness of Inca slingers firing from prepared positions. The Spanish never fully recovered from Ollantaytambo psychologically. They had discovered that they were not invincible. that Inca forces properly led and positioned could defeat them. Spanish chroniclers who had previously written dismissively about native weapons began describing the slings with genuine fear. One account describes projectiles reaching velocities sufficient to break swords in half at 150 meters. Another tells of a conquistador whose steel helmet was dented so severely by a sling stone that it had to be cut off his head, and his jaw was broken despite the metal protection. Yet another describes seeing an Inca slinger hit a moving horse at 100 meters, killing the animal instantly. These accounts, written by men who had faced native armies across the Americas, consistently single out Inca slingers as uniquely dangerous. Part of the slingers' effectiveness came from their ammunition. Inca slingers didn't merely pick up random stones. They selected projectiles carefully, choosing smooth river stones of optimal weight and shape, or crafting clay and lead bullets specifically for warfare. The projectiles varied in weight from 200 to 500 grams, with heavier stones used against armoured targets and horses. At close range, a 500-gram stone travelling at 100 kilometers per hour carried tremendous energy, enough to crack bones even through steel plate. The Spanish also learned that slingers were extraordinarily accurate. Spanish arquebusiers, firing smoothbore matchlock weapons with minimal sights, were lucky to hit a man-sized target at 50 meters. Inca slingers trained from childhood could hit specific targets at 100 meters or more. Spanish accounts describe slingers targeting horses' heads specifically, or aiming for the gap between a soldier's helmet and breastplate, or striking the same conquistador multiple times in succession. This was not area fire. This was precision marksmanship with a weapon Europeans had largely abandoned centuries earlier. The psychological impact of facing skilled slingers was profound. Spanish soldiers could see the stones coming, could hear them whistling through the air, but in the chaos of battle could do nothing to avoid them. Unlike arrows, which at least required the firer to be relatively exposed while drawing a bow, slingers could fire from behind cover, whirling the sling just long enough to release before ducking back. This made them extraordinarily difficult to suppress with return fire. After Ollantaytambo, Manco Inca withdrew deeper into the mountains to Vilcabamba, establishing what historians call the Neo-Inca state. This rump kingdom would survive until 1572, conducting guerrilla warfare against Spanish rule for over 3 decades. During those decades, Inca slingers continued to be the primary weapon of resistance. Spanish colonial accounts from the 1540s through the 1570s are filled with references to sling attacks. Spanish administrators travelling between cities were ambushed by Inca warriors who would emerge from cover, unleash a devastating barrage of sling stones, and disappear before Spanish forces could respond. Small Spanish garrisons in isolated outposts lived in constant fear of sling attacks that could come from any direction at any time. The Spanish attempted various countermeasures. They increased armour coverage, adding more protection to legs and arms. They experimented with different helmet designs that might better deflect sling stones. They trained soldiers to advance behind large shields when operating in areas where sling attacks were likely. None of these measures were entirely effective. The fundamental problem was that sling stones carried enough kinetic energy to be dangerous, even when they didn't penetrate armour, and slingers could maintain fire from ranges where Spanish weapons were ineffective. The Spanish also tried to suppress sling use among the Inca population. Colonial authorities attempted to ban slings, confiscating them where they could and punishing natives caught with them. These efforts failed completely. The sling was too simple to suppress. It could be made from materials available anywhere. Every herder needed one for protecting flocks. Every farmer needed one for driving off predators and birds. The Spanish could no more ban slings than they could ban ropes or sandals. What ultimately defeated the Incas was not Spanish military superiority, but demographics and disease. The diseases that Europeans brought to the Americas, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, killed between 60 and 90% of the indigenous population within a century of contact. Entire communities were wiped out. The social structures that had sustained Inca resistance collapsed as villages lost their elders, their leaders, their warriors. By the time the Spanish finally captured Vilcabamba in 1572 and executed the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, the resistance was already dying from causes the Spanish could not take credit for. But the memory of Inca slingers persisted. Spanish veterans of the Peruvian campaigns, when they returned to Europe, spoke of the slings with respect bordering on fear. In an age when European military doctrine focused increasingly on gunpowder weapons, these hardened soldiers had learned that sometimes the oldest weapons, wielded with sufficient skill, could be as deadly as anything modern technology provided. The Inca sling represents something profound about the conquest of the Americas. We tend to think of the Spanish victory as inevitable, a consequence of technological superiority. Guns, steel, horses, these gave the conquistadors such overwhelming advantages that native resistance was doomed from the start. But the reality was far more complex. Spanish advantages were real but not insurmountable. What the Incas lacked was not capability but time. Time to adapt. Time to develop countermeasures. Time to learn. At Cajamarca, surprise and shock were decisive. The Incas had never faced firearms, had never fought against cavalry, had never confronted an enemy willing to capture and execute their divine emperor. By the time Manco Inca raised his rebellion 4 years later, those advantages had diminished. The Incas had adapted. They learned to target horses and unarmored body parts. They learned to use terrain to neutralize Spanish cavalry. They learned Spanish tactics and even began using captured Spanish weapons and equipment. And they discovered that their traditional weapons, particularly slings, were effective even against armoured Europeans. If the demographic collapse from disease had not occurred, if the Inca Empire had remained intact and unified, if Manco Inca had had another decade to refine his tactics and train his armies, the outcome of the Spanish conquest might have been very different. The slingers showed that the technological gap was not insurmountable. At Ollantaytambo, Inca forces defeated a Spanish expedition through superior tactics and effective use of terrain. The Spanish retreated, something they almost never did during the conquest. That victory was not an accident. It was the result of careful planning, tactical innovation, and the devastating effectiveness of thousands of skilled slingers firing from elevated positions. The Spanish chroniclers who wrote about the Inca slings were not exaggerating their effectiveness to excuse Spanish defeats. If anything, they understated the threat because admitting how dangerous slings were also admitted how close the Spanish came to losing. Modern experimental archaeology has confirmed what those chroniclers reported. Slings in skilled hands can achieve ranges exceeding 400 meters, though effective combat range is much shorter. At 100 meters, a sling stone can strike with enough force to crack modern ballistic gelatin, a stand-in for human tissue, to a depth of several inches. Against historical armor, stones of 300 to 500 grams could cause serious injury even without penetration. The concussive force alone could break ribs, rupture organs, or cause traumatic brain injuries. The Spanish advantage in armor was real, but not absolute. Their advantages in cavalry and firearms were more significant, but both could be neutralized by terrain and tactics. What the Incas could not overcome was the demographic catastrophe of disease and the internal divisions that prevented unified resistance. But weapon for weapon, man for man, Spanish conquistadors learned to respect and fear Inca slingers. Today, the sling has largely disappeared from Andean military culture, replaced by modern weapons. But it persists in rural areas where herders still use slings to protect their flocks, and the tradition is passed from generation to generation. The skill that made Inca slingers so deadly has not vanished. It has merely lost its military application. When we remember the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, we should remember Cajamarca, where Spanish surprise and ruthlessness brought down an empire in an afternoon. But we should also remember Cusco, where Inca slingers bombarded Spanish positions for months, killing Juan Pizarro and bringing the conquistadors to the edge of defeat. We should remember Ollantaytambo, where tactical genius and devastating firepower from slings forced a Spanish retreat. These moments remind us that history is not inevitable, that technological superiority is not decisive, that sometimes the simplest weapons, wielded with sufficient skill and tactical intelligence, can threaten even the most advanced military forces of their age. The Inca slingers did not prevent the Spanish conquest, but they came closer than almost any other indigenous force in the Americas. They taught the conquistadors that they were not invincible. They forced the Spanish to adapt their tactics and increase their defences. They made the conquest of Peru far more difficult and costly than it might otherwise have been, and on one cold January day in 1537, on the flooded plains before Ollantaytambo, they showed the world that sling stones and tactical brilliance could defeat Spanish steel and gunpowder, For that single day, the tide of conquest reversed. For that single day, the Incas proved that the outcome was not predetermined, that resistance was possible, that adaptation and innovation could level the playing field between bronze and steel. The Spanish won in the end. Disease, internal divisions, and time were on their side. But the slingers of Manco Inca's army, whirling their braided wool weapons and sending stones whistling through the Andean air, they gave the conquistadors nightmares. They showed that technology alone does not determine history. Skill, training, tactics, terrain, and the courage to resist against impossible odds, these matter too. The slings fell silent after 1572, when the last Inca emperor was executed and Vilcabamba fell. But for 4 decades, from 1536 to 1572, Inca slingers waged a guerrilla war that the Spanish could suppress but never entirely eliminate. They were the weapon that nearly drove the conquistadors from Peru. They were the warriors who taught Francisco Pizarro's brothers that conquest would cost more than they ever imagined. They were the reason that Spanish soldiers, decades after returning to Europe, would flinch at the sound of whistling wind. This is the story rarely told when we discuss the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the story of resistance, of adaptation, of indigenous peoples learning to fight back with whatever tools they possessed. The Inca slingers were not primitive warriors overwhelmed by superior technology. They were skilled soldiers who adapted brilliantly to a new kind of warfare, who learned their enemies' weaknesses, who achieved battlefield victories that seemed impossible. They did not win the war, but they won battles. They slowed the conquest. They made the Spanish pay in blood and terror for every mile they advanced. And at Ollantaytambo, for one glorious moment, they made the conquistadors run. The lessons the Spanish learned from facing Inca slingers spread throughout their colonial empire. When conquistadors pushed into Chile in the 1540s, they encountered Mapuche warriors who had adopted sling tactics after learning about Inca successes. The Mapuche proved even more difficult to subdue than the Incas, maintaining their independence for over 300 years, and their slingers were a significant part of that resistance. Spanish military manuals from the mid-16th century began including specific instructions for dealing with indigenous slingers, something they had not needed before their Peruvian campaigns. The instructions reveal how seriously the threat was taken. Soldiers were advised to wear additional padding under their armour, particularly around the ribs and kidneys where sling stones could cause internal injuries even without penetrating steel. They were told to advance behind mantlets, large portable shields when operating in mountainous terrain where slingers might have elevation advantage. Cavalry were instructed to fit their horses with leather face guards to protect against targeted strikes to the head. These were not theoretical concerns. Spanish casualty records from the Peruvian campaigns, fragmentary as they are, show a pattern. While relatively few Spaniards died in major pitched battles, casualties from ambushes, sieges, and guerrilla actions were significant, and a substantial portion of those casualties came from sling injuries. A 1544 letter from a Spanish officer stationed near Cusco describes losing 3 soldiers in a single month to sling attacks, none of them penetrating wounds, all of them fatal injuries from blunt force trauma. The officer noted that the natives have learned where our armour is weakest and strike there with stones that hit like hammers. One of the most detailed Spanish accounts of facing Inca slingers comes from Pedro de Valdivia, who led the expedition into Chile beginning in 1540. Valdivia's letters back to Spain describe his encounters with indigenous forces who had adopted Inca military techniques, including extensive use of slings. In one letter, dated 1545, Valdivia writes about a battle where his force of 60 Spanish cavalry and several thousand Indian auxiliaries faced perhaps 20,000 Mapuche warriors. The native forces positioned themselves on hills flanking the Spanish line of advance and began a bombardment with slings that Valdivia describes as so thick the sun was obscured. He reports losing 15 horses killed outright and having 23 Spanish soldiers wounded, several seriously, before his force could close with the enemy and use their advantages in close combat. What makes Valdivia's account particularly valuable is his analysis of why the slings were so effective. He notes that the natives could maintain fire from ranges where our arquebuses could not reach them with any accuracy, and that their rate of fire far exceeded Spanish firearms. A slinger could loose a stone every few seconds, while an arquebusier needed 30 seconds or more to reload. This meant that for every Spanish shot fired, indigenous forces could respond with dozens of sling stones. In a firefight at range, numbers and rate of fire mattered more than individual weapon lethality. Valdivia also describes how difficult it was to suppress slingers. Unlike arquebusiers, who needed to stand relatively still to fire, and whose black powder smoke revealed their positions, slingers could fire from behind cover, exposing themselves only for the brief moment needed to release their projectile. Spanish cavalry trying to charge slingers on hillsides found themselves under constant fire during their entire approach, taking casualties the whole way, while the slingers could retreat up the slopes faster than horses could follow on steep terrain. The frustration in Valdivia's letters is palpable. Here was a veteran of multiple European campaigns, a conquistador who had served in Peru during the initial conquest, and he was being stymied by warriors using weapons Europeans had largely abandoned since antiquity. The effectiveness of Inca and Mapuche slingers forced Spanish tactical adaptations that influenced how they conducted warfare throughout the Americas. The conquistadors learned to avoid approaches that gave defenders elevation advantage whenever possible. They learned to advance in loose formations rather than tight ones when facing massed sling fire, spreading out to reduce the number of targets in any given area. They learned to use Indian auxiliaries as skirmishers who could engage slingers before Spanish troops committed to an assault. Perhaps most significantly, they learned patience. Early Spanish expeditions had relied on shock and speed, using surprise and the overwhelming impact of cavalry charges to break indigenous resistance before the enemy could respond effectively. Against slingers in prepared positions with elevation advantage, this approach failed. The Spanish had to accept slower, more methodical operations, reducing strongpoints one by one, often taking significant casualties in the process. This was warfare the Spanish had not anticipated fighting in the Americas. The colonial administration in Peru quickly recognized that suppressing sling use among the population was impossible, so they attempted instead to co-opt it. Spanish authorities began recruiting Inca and other indigenous warriors into colonial military forces, where their sling skills could be used in service of Spanish interests rather than against them. These indigenous auxiliary units became essential to Spanish control of Peru. When Spanish forces faced rebellions in remote areas, they increasingly relied on native troops to do the actual fighting, with Spanish soldiers providing leadership, firearm support, and cavalry. The slingers in these auxiliary forces were often the most effective troops, able to operate in mountainous terrain where Spanish cavalry was useless, and where their intimate knowledge of local geography gave them overwhelming advantages. This created a complex dynamic. The same weapon that had nearly driven the Spanish from Peru was now being used to enforce Spanish rule, wielded by indigenous soldiers who had their own reasons for cooperating with or fighting against Spanish authority. The Spanish never fully trusted these auxiliaries, always fearing they might turn their weapons against their colonial masters, and occasionally they did. But the Spanish needed them. The vastness of the Andes and the difficulty of the terrain meant that Spanish soldiers alone could never control the region. They required indigenous allies, and those allies brought their traditional weapons and skills with them. By the 1550s, the Spanish colonial regime in Peru had achieved a precarious stability. Manco Inca remained in Vilcabamba, conducting occasional raids but no longer threatening Spanish control of major cities. The massive die-off from European diseases had depopulated much of the empire, eliminating the demographic base for large-scale resistance. Spanish soldiers who had survived the early campaigns were aging, and new arrivals from Spain had never faced the kind of determined indigenous resistance that characterized the 1530s and 1540s. But the memory of Inca slingers remained vivid. Spanish soldiers stationed in Peru told stories to newcomers about the sieges of Cusco and Lima, about Ollantaytambo, about ambushes in mountain passes where stones rained down from unseen attackers. These stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They were warnings to young conquistadors who might think indigenous peoples were easy opponents. They were reminders that Spanish technological advantages, while real, were not absolute guarantees of victory. They kept Spanish forces cautious and respectful of indigenous military capabilities, which probably saved Spanish lives that might have been lost to overconfidence. The stories also reveal something about Spanish psychology. The conquistadors saw themselves as representatives of European civilization, bringing Christianity and Spanish culture to peoples they regarded as primitive. Yet these primitives, with their ancient weapons, had nearly destroyed Spanish expeditions, had killed prominent conquistadors, had forced battlefield retreats. This created cognitive dissonance that Spanish chroniclers struggled to resolve. Some emphasized the overwhelming numbers the Incas could field, suggesting that Spanish defeats came from being outnumbered rather than outfought. Others stressed the treacherous terrain and Inca knowledge of local geography, framing Spanish difficulties as environmental rather than military. But the more honest accounts admit what the evidence clearly shows. Inca slingers, properly employed, were devastating weapons against Spanish forces. They could kill armoured men, could bring down horses, could maintain fire from ranges where Spanish weapons could not effectively respond. The Incas' failure to drive out the Spanish was not due to inferior weaponry, but to the catastrophic demographic collapse from disease, the internal divisions that prevented unified resistance, and the willingness of many indigenous groups to ally with the Spanish against their former Inca overlords. In 1572, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo finally decided to end the Neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba permanently. He assembled a substantial military force, over 250 Spanish soldiers and several thousand indigenous auxiliaries, and invaded Vilcabamba with the explicit goal of capturing or killing the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru. The campaign was methodical and brutal. Spanish forces pushed into the remote jungle territory, fighting a series of small engagements against Inca defenders. The slingers who had been so effective in the Andean highlands found their weapon less suited to jungle warfare. Dense vegetation limited the range at which they could engage, and the humidity affected their woolen slings. The Spanish pressed forward, and by June 1572 they had captured Vilcabamba. Tupac Amaru fled further into the jungle, but was eventually captured in September. Toledo had Tupac Amaru brought back to Cusco, where he was tried and condemned to death. On September 24, 1572, the last Inca emperor was beheaded in Cusco's main plaza, the same plaza where his ancestors had once ruled an empire. With his death, organized Inca resistance ended, but the slingers did not disappear. They became part of the fabric of colonial Peruvian society, herders and farmers who maintained their traditional skills, passing them to their children. Occasionally, during the many rebellions that characterized Spanish colonial rule, slingers would emerge again, targeting Spanish authorities or indigenous collaborators. The Great Rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780, named for the last emperor, saw indigenous forces again using slings against Spanish troops, with limited success in the face of more advanced Spanish firearms that had evolved considerably in the 2 centuries since the conquest. What the Inca slingers represent in the broader context of the Spanish conquest is the possibility of resistance. Too often, the narrative of European colonization of the Americas frames indigenous defeat as inevitable, a consequence of technological disparities so overwhelming that native peoples never had a chance. The steel versus stone narrative suggests that the outcome was predetermined from the moment Europeans arrived, but the experiences at Cusco and Ollantaytambo tell a different story. They show that when indigenous forces adapted tactically, when they learned their enemies' weaknesses and developed countermeasures, when they used terrain intelligently and employed their traditional weapons to maximum advantage, they could defeat Spanish forces in battle. The problem was not capability, but sustainability. The Incas could win battles, but not the war, because the war was not primarily military. It was demographic, epidemiological, and political. The diseases killed faster than any weapon. The internal divisions among indigenous peoples, with groups like the Canary and Huanca allying with the Spanish against their Inca overlords, meant that the Spanish always had local allies who knew the terrain and understood indigenous tactics. The sheer distance from Spain, while it limited Spanish reinforcements, also meant that defeated Spanish forces had nowhere to retreat to. They had to win or die, which made them fight with desperate determination. Manco Inca, for all his tactical brilliance, could never forge the kind of unified indigenous coalition that might have expelled the Spanish entirely. Too many groups saw the Spanish as potential allies against the Incas, whom they viewed as oppressors. By the time these groups realized the Spanish were worse, it was too late. The demographic collapse had begun, and Spanish control was too entrenched to dislodge. Yet within these constraints, Inca slingers achieved remarkable things. They killed conquistadors who thought themselves invincible. They forced Spanish tactical adaptations. They made the conquest of Peru far more difficult and costly than the conquest of Mexico had been. They showed that indigenous peoples could learn, adapt, and fight back effectively against European military technology. The sling itself deserves recognition as a sophisticated weapon system. Modern understanding of ballistics and sports science has allowed researchers to appreciate just how skilled Inca slingers must have been. The mechanics of slinging involve complex rotational movements, precise timing of release, and sophisticated understanding of trajectory and windage. Achieving accuracy at 100 meters or more requires years of practice and natural aptitude. The fact that Inca boys learned this skill from childhood, practicing daily for years before entering military service, meant that the average Inca slinger had far more experience with his weapon than the average Spanish soldier had with his arquebus. This expertise differential mattered. Spanish firearms of the 16th century were inaccurate beyond 50 meters and slow to reload. Individual Spanish arquebusiers could be outmatched by skilled slingers at range, which is why Spanish tactics relied heavily on cavalry charges and close combat, where steel weapons and armor provided decisive advantages. When terrain or tactical situation prevented Spanish forces from closing to close combat range, as at Ollantaytambo, their advantages evaporated and Inca slingers could dominate the battlefield. The sling also had logistical advantages that Spanish weapons lacked. Ammunition was literally everywhere in the form of stones. An Inca slinger never had to worry about running out unless every rock within reach had been thrown. Spanish arquebusiers, by contrast, required manufactured ammunition, gunpowder that had to be kept dry, and elaborate supply lines to keep them equipped. In extended campaigns in remote areas, Spanish forces often found themselves short of ammunition, while Inca forces never had this problem. Maintenance was similarly asymmetric. A sling that broke could be replaced in hours by anyone who knew how to braid cord. An arquebus that malfunctioned required a skilled gunsmith and replacement parts that might not exist anywhere in Peru. Spanish weapons were more lethal individually but far more fragile logistically. These practical considerations mattered in a theatre of war as vast and difficult as the Andes. Spanish supply lines stretched thousands of miles across ocean, and then hundreds more across mountains. Everything Spanish forces needed had to be imported or manufactured locally with limited resources. Indigenous forces, fighting on their home ground, had access to everything they needed immediately. This should have been a decisive advantage, and for a time it nearly was. The failure of the Inca rebellion ultimately came down to three factors: disease, disunity, and the Spanish ability to outlast sieges and ambushes until indigenous forces had to disperse for harvest and planting. None of these had anything to do with Spanish military superiority. The Spanish won despite taking significant casualties and losing battles. They won because they could afford losses that the Incas could not, because disease was doing their work for them, and because enough indigenous groups sided with them to provide the local troops and knowledge Spanish forces desperately needed. Looking at the broader sweep of Spanish conquest in the Americas, the Peruvian campaign stands out as one of the most difficult and contested. The conquest of Mexico, while involving several hard-fought battles, was accomplished in 2 years. Peru took decades and was never entirely complete, with the Neo-Inca state maintaining independence for 36 years after the fall of Cusco. The difference was partly geography. Peru's mountains provided refuges where indigenous forces could retreat and regroup. But it was also the effectiveness of indigenous resistance, and Inca slingers were a crucial component of that resistance. If we want to understand the Spanish conquest of the Americas as something other than a simple story of technological determinism, we need to look at cases like Ollantaytambo. We need to see the moments when indigenous forces won, when they adapted and learned and fought back effectively. These moments do not change the ultimate outcome, but they change how we understand that outcome. The Incas did not lose because they were inferior warriors or because their weapons were inadequate. They lost because they faced an enemy backed by industrial capacity they could not match, reinforced by allies from among their own subject peoples, and assisted by pathogens they had no defense against. In the purely military sphere, when factors were controlled, Inca forces could and did defeat Spanish expeditions. The slingers who drove Hernando Pizarro from Ollantaytambo were not lucky or facing incompetent opponents. They were skilled warriors employing well-crafted tactics against veteran conquistadors who had defeated indigenous forces across the Americas, and they won. That victory could not be sustained, could not be repeated often enough to change the war's outcome, but it happened. It proved that the conquistadors were not invincible. that indigenous weapons and tactics could prevail under the right circumstances, the Spanish recognized this, which is why their accounts of Inca slingers are filled with respect mixed with fear. Modern popular understanding of the conquest tends to focus on the exotic, on the shock of first contact, on the capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca. But the real story of the conquest, the part that mattered most to the people living through it, was the decades of resistance that followed. It was the sieges and ambushes, the raids and guerrilla warfare, the slow-grinding conflict that killed far more Spanish soldiers than the famous set-piece battles ever did. And throughout that conflict, from 1536 to 1572, Inca slingers were among the most effective indigenous warriors the Spanish faced. The technical specifications of Inca slings and their projectiles deserve closer examination because they reveal sophisticated understanding of physics and material science. The length of the sling, typically 1.5 to 2 meters, was not arbitrary. This length provided optimal velocity for projectiles while remaining manageable for the slinger. Shorter slings generated less velocity. Longer ones became difficult to control. The Incas had worked out through generations of use exactly what length provided the best balance. The projectiles themselves varied based on intended target and available materials. For anti-personnel use, stones weighing 200 to 300 grams were typical, large enough to cause serious injury, but light enough to achieve good range. For targeting horses or armoured enemies, heavier projectiles of 400 to 500 grams were preferred. These sacrificed some range but delivered devastating impact energy. Some Spanish accounts mention lead projectiles, which would have been denser than stone and thus carried more energy for a given size. The Incas had access to lead and certainly knew how to work it, so lead sling bullets are plausible, though archaeological evidence is limited. Clay projectiles were also mentioned in chronicles. These could be moulded to specific shapes and sizes, possibly with protrusions or ridges that would cause the projectile to whistle in flight, creating psychological effects. The whistling of sling stones in flight is mentioned repeatedly in Spanish accounts, and it was not accidental. A projectile designed to whistle announces its presence, which seems counterproductive for a weapon. But the psychological effect of hearing hundreds of projectiles whistling through the air, knowing that any one of them might strike you, and there is nothing you can do to stop it, this was a weapon itself. The Spanish feared the sound of incoming sling stones. It represented death from an unseen attacker at a range where they could not effectively respond. That fear made Spanish soldiers hesitant, made them hunker behind shields rather than advancing aggressively, made them choose defensive positions even when Spanish doctrine emphasized offensive action. The accuracy that skilled slingers achieved was the result of both technique and equipment. The sling had to be balanced, with both cords of equal length and weight. The pouch had to be sized correctly for the projectile. The slinger had to master the rotational motion, typically 2 or 3 spins before release, enough to build velocity but not so many that accuracy suffered. The release point had to be precisely timed, with the projectile leaving the sling at exactly the right moment in the rotation to send it toward the target. This required extraordinary hand-eye coordination and kinesthetic sense, the kind of skill that can only be developed through years of practice. Spanish soldiers who attempted to learn sling use found it nearly impossible to achieve competence, let alone the accuracy that Inca warriors displayed. Several accounts describe Spanish soldiers trying to use captured slings and failing miserably, unable to hit anything, and often striking themselves with their own projectiles. This was not a weapon that could be picked up and used effectively without extensive training. It was a specialized tool that required dedication and skill, which made Inca mastery of it all the more impressive. The training regimen for Inca slingers began in childhood, probably around age 5 or 6. Boys would start with small slings and light projectiles, learning the basic rotational motion and release technique. As they grew and their strength increased, they would progress to larger slings and heavier projectiles. By their teenage years, young Inca males were expected to be competent slingers, able to hit targets at 50 meters or more. By the time they entered military service in their 20s, they had 15 to 20 years of experience. This created a martial culture where every adult male was a trained warrior with at least one weapon he had mastered completely. The Spanish had nothing comparable. Spanish military training in the 16th century was haphazard at best. Soldiers learned on the job, and many conquistadors had little formal military training before arriving in the Americas. They relied on their equipment advantages and tactical doctrine rather than individual skill at arms. Against indigenous forces where every warrior had trained with his weapons since childhood, this created situations where individual Spanish soldiers were outmatched in skill even if their equipment was superior. The Spanish advantage lay in combined arms tactics, using cavalry and infantry together, and in their discipline and unit cohesion. But when fighting devolved into individual skirmishes or ambushes where Spanish tactical advantages could not be brought to bear, indigenous warriors often prevailed. This happened repeatedly during the Peruvian campaigns, with Spanish soldiers isolated and killed by indigenous attackers who were simply more skilled warriors. The Siege of Cusco demonstrated another advantage of slings that Spanish firearms lacked. They were quiet. An arquebus produced a loud report and clouds of black powder smoke that revealed the firer's position. A sling made only a soft swish of air, and the slinger could be behind cover before the projectile even reached its target. In siege warfare, where defenders needed to avoid drawing return fire, this was an enormous advantage. Inca slingers on the walls of Sacsayhuaman or on the hills around Cusco could maintain constant harassment of Spanish positions without exposing themselves to effective counterfire. Spanish arquebusiers trying to suppress them found themselves firing at fleeting targets, or simply at areas where they thought slingers might be, wasting precious ammunition while the stone barrage continued unabated. The Spanish eventually learned to largely ignore individual sling fire, unless it was so concentrated as to prevent movement entirely. This was a significant psychological shift. European soldiers were trained to respond aggressively to enemy fire, to suppress it, and then assault. But against slingers in prepared positions, this approach did not work. The Spanish had to accept taking casualties from sling fire as the price of operating in the Andes, which was an admission that they could not control the battlefield the way they were accustomed to doing. This loss of control ate at Spanish morale. Conquistadors who had crossed an ocean and conquered kingdoms found themselves killed by stones thrown by warriors they considered primitives. The humiliation mixed with the danger created a toxic stew of resentment and fear. Spanish accounts from the period increasingly describe indigenous peoples in dehumanizing terms, perhaps as a psychological defense mechanism against the reality that these people were fighting effectively and inflicting real casualties. After the conquest, as Spanish colonial rule solidified, the martial culture that produced skilled slingers gradually eroded. The Spanish prohibited large gatherings that might be used for military training. They disrupted traditional community structures where skills were passed from generation to generation. They converted indigenous peoples to Christianity and suppressed practices associated with Inca religion, some of which had military training components. Within a few generations, the skills that made Inca slingers so deadly began to fade, but they never disappeared entirely. In remote areas, herders continued using slings. The practical need for the weapon ensured its survival, even when its military application was forbidden. During the colonial rebellions of the 18th century, indigenous forces again employed slingers, though by then Spanish firearms had advanced considerably, and the balance had shifted more decisively in favour of European military technology. Yet even in the 18th century, Spanish colonial authorities took the threat of indigenous slingers seriously. Military manuals and administrative documents from the period include references to slings as a weapon Spanish forces might face in rural areas. This is remarkable considering that 2 centuries had passed since the conquest. The institutional memory of how effective Inca slingers had been persisted within Spanish colonial military culture long after the actual threat had diminished. This suggests that the experience of facing Inca slingers had been traumatic enough for Spanish forces that it created lasting doctrinal changes in how they approached indigenous warfare. In the 19th century, as Latin American independence movements swept away Spanish colonial rule, the sling had largely disappeared as a military weapon. Firearms had become cheap and plentiful enough that indigenous forces could arm themselves with muskets and rifles rather than relying on traditional weapons. But the memory of Inca military prowess, including the slingers who had defied Spanish conquest, became part of nationalist narratives in Peru and other Andean nations. The Incas who had resisted so fiercely were recast as heroic ancestors, and their weapons, including the sling, were celebrated as symbols of indigenous resistance against colonial oppression. Today, competitive sling throwing exists as a sport in some Andean communities, a conscious effort to preserve ancestral skills. practitioners can achieve impressive accuracy and range, giving modern observers a glimpse of what Spanish conquistadors faced. Videos of skilled slingers hitting targets at 70 or 80 meters look effortless, the slinger barely seeming to aim before the stone flashes toward the target. But these modern practitioners will admit they are nowhere near the skill level of their ancestors, who practiced daily from childhood and whose lives depended on their accuracy. If modern slingers with limited practice time can achieve such proficiency, it becomes easier to imagine what warriors with decades of experience could do. The archaeological record provides some physical evidence of sling use during the conquest period. Excavations at sites associated with the Siege of Cusco have recovered large numbers of sling stones, concentrated in areas where Spanish defenders would have been positioned. Analysis of these stones shows selection for specific weight ranges and shapes, confirming that slingers chose their ammunition carefully, rather than using whatever rocks were convenient. Some stones show evidence of having been shaped or modified, ground smooth to improve aerodynamics. This indicates that at least some slingers prepared ammunition in advance for combat use, treating their projectiles as military equipment rather than impromptu weapons. Spanish armour from the period sometimes shows damage consistent with sling impact, dents and deformations that could not have been caused by the bronze weapons typical of Inca armies. One helmet in a museum collection has a dent nearly 2 inches deep, caused by a blow that would almost certainly have killed or seriously injured the wearer, despite the metal protection. The helmet is dated to the mid-16th century and was recovered in Peru, making it possible, if not provable, that it was damaged by an Inca sling stone. The human remains from conquest-era contexts sometimes show injuries consistent with sling trauma. Fractured skulls, broken long bones, and rib fractures that show no cut marks or evidence of bladed weapon trauma, but do show the kind of crushing damage associated with high-velocity impacts. Not all of these injuries can definitively be attributed to slings. Some might have been caused by clubs or other blunt weapons, but the pattern is consistent with what we would expect if sling stones were commonly causing serious casualties. The DNA evidence from colonial-era Peru tells the grim story of demographic collapse that ultimately doomed indigenous resistance. Population genetics studies show severe bottlenecks in indigenous populations beginning in the 1530s and continuing through the 17th century. This represents the die-off from European diseases, primarily smallpox and measles, but also typhus, influenza, and other pathogens. The populations that had sustained Inca military resistance simply disappeared. By 1600, the indigenous population of Peru had declined by an estimated 90% from pre-conquest levels. No amount of military skill or effective weaponry could overcome demographic catastrophe on that scale. This context is essential for understanding why Inca military resistance failed, despite their occasional battlefield successes. Every victory, like Ollantaytambo, cost the Incas casualties they could not replace. Every month that passed, disease killed thousands more potential warriors. The Spanish, meanwhile, had a steady, if slow, stream of reinforcements from Spain, and they could recruit from indigenous groups that allied with them or remained neutral. The mathematics of attrition favoured the Spanish not because they were better warriors, but because they had access to deeper reserves, and because disease was killing their enemies faster than combat. If we construct a counterfactual scenario where European diseases did not exist, where the Inca population remained stable rather than collapsing, the Spanish conquest of Peru becomes far more difficult to imagine succeeding. Manco Inca's rebellion had already demonstrated that Spanish forces could be fought to a stalemate, and occasionally defeated when the Incas employed proper tactics. With a stable population to draw on, the Incas could have sustained that resistance indefinitely. Spanish reinforcements would have had to cross an ocean and then fight their way through hostile territory. The logistical challenge would have been immense, possibly insurmountable. The slingers would have been part of that sustained resistance, continuing to inflict casualties and limit Spanish mobility. Over time, the Incas would have captured more Spanish equipment, learned more about Spanish tactics, and potentially developed more effective countermeasures. The advantage would have shifted increasingly toward the defenders who knew the terrain and had the population to sustain a long conflict. But this counterfactual highlights what actually happened. The diseases did exist, the population did collapse, and Spanish conquest succeeded not primarily through military superiority, but through the inadvertent biological warfare of introduced pathogens. The Inca slingers were ultimately defeated not by Spanish steel but by Spanish smallpox. The story of the Inca Slingers matters because it complicates our understanding of the conquest. It shows that indigenous peoples were not passive victims of European expansion, but active participants who fought back, adapted, and occasionally won. It shows that European technological advantages were real, but not insurmountable, that traditional weapons in skilled hands could threaten even armoured soldiers with firearms. It shows that the conquest was contingent, that outcomes were not predetermined, that with different circumstances the history of the Americas might have been very different. When we remember Cajamarca, we should also remember Ollantaytambo. When we think about Spanish conquistadors as invincible warriors whose victory was inevitable, we should think about Juan Pizarro dying from a sling stone to the head, about Hernando Pizarro retreating in defeat, about Spanish soldiers cowering behind walls while stones rained down on them for months. These moments of Spanish vulnerability do not erase the ultimate Spanish victory, but they remind us that victory was purchased at high cost and was never quite as certain as later narratives suggested. The Inca slingers whirling their woolen cords on the terraces of Ollantaytambo, sending stones whistling down at Spanish soldiers struggling through flooded ground, they were not primitives armed with inadequate weapons. They were skilled warriors employing sophisticated tactics and effective weaponry, warriors who, on that January day in 1537, proved themselves superior to some of the most experienced soldiers Europe could produce. They could not sustain that superiority. Disease and division and distance from Spanish supply sources all conspired to ensure Spanish victory eventually. But for that day, and for days like it during the decades of resistance, the slingers showed what was possible. They showed that the outcome was not foreordained, that indigenous peoples could learn and adapt and fight back, and they forced the Spanish to pay in blood and fear for every mile they conquered in Peru. The thunder of sling stones may have faded into history, but the memory of what they achieved endures, a testament to the courage and skill of the warriors who wielded them, and to the resilience of peoples who refused to surrender without resistance. The day the Inca slingers halted the Spanish advance at Ollantaytambo stands as proof that technological advantage alone does not determine history, that human agency, skill, and determination matter, and that sometimes the oldest weapons wielded with sufficient expertise can threaten even the most modern forces of their age.